Okay, so we are moving on to Unit 8, Lesson 2. This is a continuation of the lesson that we started yesterday. Um, in this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at the men that became the captains of industry, but also in response to a lot of this industrialization will be the rise of labor unions. So, our lesson objectives for our lesson today, okay, we're going to be able to determine why some people got extremely wealthy during this time period. We're going to explain the beginnings of the labor movement and unions and explain how government began to regulate big business. So, during this time period after the Civil War, for the most part, the federal government did not regulate and do anything to businesses and industry. They left them alone, they did not try to control them. And this led to a period of great growth, and you had several men that you see on the right hand side here that became known as the captains of industry: Andrew Carnegie, JP Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Thomas Edison. So, Andrew Carnegie is an immigrant, actually. He comes from Scotland. And when he comes to the United States, he builds a huge steel industry. He uses vertical organization, which is a process by he controlled all aspects of his steel business. He controlled the iron ore fields, which is what you use to turn into steel. He controlled the transportation, he controlled the railroads. So, everything that he needed in order to make his business succeed, he owned. So, therefore, he basically reaped all of the benefits. Um, in 1901, he sells his company to a group of businessmen who form the U.S. Steel Company. He spends the rest of his life giving his money away, $350 million. He gives his money to good causes like building libraries, helping charities. He helps to build schools. If you're familiar with Carnegie Hall, which is a place, music theater in New York, that was all built on money from Andrew Carnegie. This is called philanthropy, where people that are extremely wealthy give their money away to good causes. JP Morgan was an investment banker who worked to stop financial panics. He invested in many industries that helped to spread his wealth. He invested in steel with US Steel. He also was a huge supporter in spreading electricity. We talked in the last lesson about Thomas Edison and the invention of the electric light bulb, but he's going to need money from somebody in order to get electricity everywhere. So JP Morgan's going to be that person. John D. Rockefeller is the owner of Standard Oil Company. In 1872, he controls 4% of the oil refining industry, and a short 12 years later, he's going to own 90% of that. He puts all of his money back into his business. He used cutthroat tactics to kind of kick other people out of the business, and so he could control all of it. So at this time, we have food, which was the biggest of all industries. The meatpacking industry grows in Chicago, led by Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift. There was, as I said, no government regulations. So a lot of these food places where things were shipped were very unsafe and unsanitary. Chicago was kind of a central point in the United States, so a lot of meat could be shipped out from Chicago to the east, also to the west and the south, but there are going to be some really horrendous unsanitary conditions. So, workers at this time faced long hours, they faced child labor. There were no laws against having children work, so it was very common for children to not go to school and to work. The wages they were paid were very low, only $1.50 to $5 a day, and the conditions were very unsafe. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire leads to the death of over 100 women who are trapped in the factory as a fire breaks out, and many of them have to leap to their deaths to get out of the fire. Individual workers have very little power at this time, so the workers are all going to come together and try to figure out how can we come together to make our lives better in our workplace. So they form what's called a union. A union is a group of people who work in a particular field or business, and they form as an organization collectively so that everyone has a voice. So, for example, today we have teachers' unions, we have police unions, we have firefighter unions, there's unions with electricians and plumbers and truck drivers. Like any business that or any job, it's very common for people to participate in a union. Um, so we start to see the rise of these unions. You have the Knights of Labor, which was not very successful, but later on you'll see the AFL formed, and these are more for the skilled trades. And they ask for shorter hours, higher wages, and better working conditions. You have the Congress of Industrial Organizations, but to stop the growth of labor unions, big business is going to try to shut these things down. They can lock people out of their jobs, refuse to give jobs to people if they identify as members of a union. They blacklist people. They make a list of union members so that no business will hire them. They also can do what's called a yellow dog contract, make workers sign a contract not to join a union. So this is the way that businesses would try to stop them. But unions can also fight back. Union methods include collective bargaining, so where talks are held between an employer and a labor union to settle disputes about working hours, about wages. Arbitration, having a third neutral person settle the dispute. If that fails, then the workers can use their strongest weapon, which is a strike. So you see here, a strike is when all of the workers and members of unions will walk off the job. So some of these strikes led to threats of violence. You have the Haymarket riot, Carnegie's Homestead, and the Pullman Railroad Car Company strike, where some people are actually killed fighting for their workers' rights. So at this point, laws are going to begin to be passed to help control the spread of this big business. States will pass laws limiting child labor. They'll try to improve working conditions in factories. They pass laws for minimum wage, which means you can only be paid like below a certain amount. So, for example, today I think minimum wage now in Massachusetts is almost up to $15 an hour. So, a business cannot pay you less than that. They have to pay you at least that much money. They pass laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, and Congress will try to protect consumers from anti competitive practices. So, one of the big things that is going to expose some of the horrendousness of the meatpacking industry is based upon a novel by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. So, when you have on your guided notes, what's The Jungle? It's a novel that attempted to show the plight of poor immigrants. It also tells about the filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. President Roosevelt read it and was revolted. So he's going to push to have laws passed that regulate the food industry to make sure that, we're not eating things that are poisonous or going to make us sick. So he calls for the creation of the FDA. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. It's still around today. It's set up to regulate product standards and quality. So food has to be food and drug or, prescriptions, like all the things that we consume in the United States should be approved by the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that, again, what we're eating as Americans is safe and is like not going to make us sick. The FDA also is responsible for like recalling certain foods if there is some sort of disease outbreak. And they're the ones that kind of monitor and regulate. The Meat Inspection Act is also passed. Lastly, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is created, which has the power to tell businesses to stop certain practices and can sue them. All of these laws are designed to protect us as consumers. So the second industrial revolution marks a lot of change. We're going to talk in the next lesson about a period of time called the Gilded Age and how this time period led to people becoming extremely wealthy, but then there were also people that became extremely poor. And we'll discuss that and the reaction to that Gilded Age in the next unit.